German prisoners arrived in America wanting revenge, but they found something they did not know how to explain. 4 months. Many had survived on thin soup and hard bread, warned that being captured by the United States would mean hunger and humiliation. In the first American camp, the guards said nothing. They simply handed each man a metal tray and pointed toward a mess hall that smelled of fried meat and fresh coffee. Inside, rows of steaming plates, white bread and fruit stretched farther than most of those soldiers had seen since before the war. Some laughed nervously, convinced it was a trap. Others felt only shame, realizing that they were about to eat better as prisoners than their families did as free citizens in Germany. In diaries and letters, these men would later admit that no speech, no propaganda shook their faith in victory as much as that first American meal. If you want to understand how logistics changed the course of the war, leave your comment and subscribe to the channel. Between 1942 and 1945, more than 370,000 German prisoners of war arrived on American soil. Most came directly from North Africa, Sicily and, later, from France and the Western Front. They expected harsh treatment, interrogation rooms, and the bare minimum needed to keep them alive. What they found instead was a food supply system so vast, so efficient and so abundant that many of them could not reconcile it with the propaganda they had absorbed for years. In the Reich, civilians received ration cards that barely covered basic needs. Soldiers on the Eastern Front survived on black bread, ersatz coffee and occasional meat that often came from horses killed in combat. Germany's industrial base was overloaded. Fuel reserves were dwindling and the idea of surplus was a distant memory. Yet here, in prisoner of war camps scattered across Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas and dozens of other states, German soldiers were eating 3 full meals a day, sometimes with the chance to go back for seconds. The logistics behind this system were not accidental. The United States had ratified the Geneva Convention in 1929, and military planners took the obligation seriously. Feeding prisoners was not just a legal requirement. It became a strategic demonstration of American industrial capacity. The War Department coordinated with the Department of Agriculture, the Office of Price Administration and regional food suppliers to ensure that every camp received consistent shipments of meat, vegetables, bread, dairy, and even coffee and sugar. The transportation networks that had been built to supply military bases in Europe and the Pacific were equally capable of delivering food to camps in the heart of the United States. Refrigerated rail cars, long-haul truck routes and centralized distribution centers made it possible to move perishable goods thousands of miles without significant spoilage. For the German prisoners, the scale of this operation was incomprehensible. Many came from cities where a single train delivering supplies once a week was considered a logistical triumph. Now they witnessed convoys of trucks arriving daily, unloading crates of fresh produce, sides of beef, sacks of flour, and canned goods in quantities that seemed endless. The camp kitchens operated with a level of organization that mirrored military precision. Cooks, many of them trained by the Army Quartermaster Corps, prepared meals using standardized recipes designed to meet nutritional requirements established by military dietitians. Breakfast often included eggs, bacon, toast with butter and coffee. Lunch might feature roast pork, mashed potatoes, green beans and bread. Dinner could bring beef stew, rice, carrots and pie for dessert. These were not luxury meals, but they were consistent, varied and far superior to what most German civilians were eating in bombed-out cities under Allied air raids. Prisoners who had fought at Stalingrad or survived the retreat from North Africa found themselves eating better than at any point in their entire service in the Wehrmacht. Letters written home, which were censored but still allowed to convey general impressions, began to reflect a disturbing perception. A soldier in a camp in Missouri wrote to his brother in Hamburg that he was ashamed to describe his daily meals because he knew his family was surviving on turnips and watery soup. But that was not yet the most critical part. The abundance did not stop at food. Prisoners received new uniforms, boots, coats, and even personal hygiene items. Soap, razor blades, toothpaste, and other personal goods were distributed regularly. Medical care was provided by trained personnel, and sick prisoners were treated in infirmaries equipped with medicines that many German field hospitals no longer had access to. Prisoners could attend educational classes, take part in sports leagues, and even receive pay for work performed on farms or in factories. The pay was minimal, but it allowed them to buy small luxuries at camp canteens, including chocolate, cigarettes, and American magazines. For soldiers who had spent years fighting a war defined by scarcity, the contrast was overwhelming. Some adapted quickly, grateful for the relief. Others struggled with deep cognitive dissonance, unable to accept that the enemy they had been told was weak and decadent could sustain such a system. Intelligence officers who monitored prisoner morale took note of these changes. The Office of Strategic Services and military intelligence units conducted interviews with selected prisoners, and the findings were consistent. Many expressed shock was at the conditions of their captivity, but at the implications of what they were witnessing. A captured Africa Corps officer, interviewed in a camp in Arizona, stated plainly that if America could afford to feed its enemies so well while fighting a two-front war, then Germany had no chance of winning. He explained that he had believed the propaganda about American industrial weakness, about a nation too divided and too soft to sustain a prolonged conflict. Leave a like if you are following this story, and turn on the notification bell so you do not miss the next documentaries. Now, sitting in a barracks with electric lights, clean bedding and access to a camp library, he understood that every assumption he had made was wrong. The same feeling appeared in confidential reports from other camps. A sergeant captured in Normandy wrote in a diary entry, later reviewed by camp authorities, that the food alone proved Germany had lost the war years earlier, even if no one in Berlin was willing to admit it. What came next would change everything. As the war advanced, more prisoners arrived from the collapsing Western and Eastern fronts. These men brought first-hand accounts of the final months of the Reich. They described cities reduced to rubble, supply lines that no longer existed, and units fighting with dwindling ammunition and no hope of resupply. They spoke of soldiers eating grass, of wounded men left without morphine, of entire divisions that surrendered not because they were defeated in battle, but because they were starving. When these men entered American camps and saw the scale of the feeding operation, the psychological impact was immediate. Some refused to believe it was real. Others wept openly, realizing that their families at home were suffering in ways they could no longer ignore. The contrast between their experience in the Wehrmacht, their experience as prisoners, became a source of profound discouragement. It was not cruelty that broke them. It was generosity backed by an industrial power they could not comprehend. The German High Command was aware of this problem, but there was little it could do to counter it. Propaganda efforts tried to frame American abundance as a temporary illusion, a trick designed to weaken German resolve. Radio broadcasts from Berlin claimed that the prisoners were being drugged or brainwashed, that the food was poisoned or mixed with sedatives. These messages were widely ignored. Prisoners who had seen the logistics firsthand, who had watched trucks arrive every day with fresh supplies, who had eaten meals better than anything they had known in years, were not convinced by the desperate narratives of a collapsing regime. The more propaganda insisted that America was weak, the more absurd it sounded to men who were living proof of the opposite. No one in that room expected the next message. In early 1945, as the war in Europe entered its final phase, intelligence reports from prisoner interrogations were compiled into strategic assessments that reached the highest levels of Allied command. One report, declassified decades later, summarized the psychological impact of the POW experience on German morale. It concluded that the treatment of prisoners in American camps had become an involuntary, but highly effective form of psychological warfare. by demonstrating the sheer scale of American industrial and agricultural capacity. The camps undermined German soldiers' faith in their own leadership and their belief in ultimate victory. The report noted that many prisoners expressed a desire to remain in the United States after the war, not out of ideological conversion, but from the recognition that their homeland had been devastated beyond repair, and that the nation which had defeated them was the only one with the resources to rebuild. The logistical machinery that made this possible was the same system that supplied Allied forces across Europe and the Pacific. The United States produced more food during the war than at any previous point in its history. Farmers expanded cultivated acreage, adopted new techniques, and increased yields with the support of government programs and agricultural research institutions. Refrigeration plants operated around the clock. Canneries processed millions of tons of vegetables and fruit. Grain elevators stored surpluses of wheat and corn that could be shipped anywhere in the world. This was not just agricultural production. It was a coordinated industrial food system designed to sustain millions of soldiers, millions of civilians in Allied nations, and hundreds of thousands of prisoners. The fact that America could afford to feed its enemies without compromising its own war effort was a demonstration of power that no battle could replicate. The following report would destabilize the entire operation. In the final weeks of the war, as German forces collapsed and the Reich disintegrated, intelligence officers noted a disturbing trend. Some prisoners, particularly those who had been held in camps for years, expressed reluctance to go home. They had adapted to a life of stability, regular meals, and relative safety. They had learned English, formed friendships with guards and camp workers, and, in some cases, even been allowed to work in nearby communities. For these men, the prospect of returning to a destroyed Germany, where food was scarce, infrastructure shattered, and the future uncertain, was less attractive than remaining in captivity. This created a logistical and political dilemma. The Geneva Convention required repatriation, but forcing men to return to a country that could not sustain them raised ethical questions that military planners had not anticipated. When the war ended, the contrast between American abundance and German collapse was undeniable. Prisoners who returned to Germany carried with them stories that contradicted everything the Nazi regime had claimed about the weakness of democracy and the superiority of the German system. They described camps where food was plentiful, where prisoners were treated with a level of respect that shocked them, and where logistics alone proved that the United States possessed resources no European power could match. These accounts spread through communities, undermining whatever faith remained in the propaganda that had sustained the war effort for so long. In occupied Germany, American forces continued to operate with the same logistical efficiency, distributing food aid to starving civilians and demonstrating once again that the nation, which had defeated the Reich, was also the only one capable of preventing mass hunger in its wake. The strategic lesson was clear. Wars are not won solely by firepower or tactical brilliance. They are won by the ability to sustain armies, supply populations, and maintain operations over time. The United States built a system that could produce, transport, and distribute resources on a scale no other nation could replicate. German soldiers who fought with courage and discipline still lost, because their country could not match the industrial and agricultural capacity of its enemy. The prisoners who ate American food in camps across the Midwest understood this long before their leaders did. They saw the convoys, the warehouses, the endless supply chains, and realized that the war had been lost not on the battlefield, but in the factories, farms, and railways that made American victory inevitable. Hitler and the German High Command believed that willpower and ideological commitment could overcome material disadvantages. They dismissed American industrial strength as the product of a weak and divided society. They assumed that a nation focused on consumer goods and comfort could not mobilize effectively for total war. Every assumption proved catastrophic. Prisoners who returned to Germany after 1945 carried with them the knowledge that the Reich had been defeated not by superior soldiers, but by a superior system. They saw it with their own eyes, tasted it in every meal, and understood it in a way no propaganda could erase. The real Superweapon was not a secret technology or a brilliant strategy. It was the ability to feed millions of people, including the enemy, without hesitation or shortage. That capacity, more than any tank or aircraft, defined the outcome of the Second World War. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from, and share this video with anyone who appreciates real history. Thank you for watching Deep History.